This is HOA checkmate. And yes, the tow truck really showed up. I am standing in my driveway at 6 in the morning with a shovel in my hands, and Carol is already screaming at me about the snow pile at the edge of my property line. She is waving a laminated policy sheet in my face and telling me I have 24 hours to move every flake, or the HOA will fine me $500 per day. The pile is 3 feet high and sitting exactly where the plow deposited it after clearing our street in Aurora Pines Estates, and she is acting like I built a monument to chaos. I moved to Sioux Falls 2 years ago to start a landscaping business and bought a townhouse in this subdivision because the price was right and the commute was easy. The Aurora Pines Estates Association has a reputation for being strict, but I figured I could handle a few extra rules if it meant a quiet neighborhood and access to the community amenities. What I did not know was that Carol, the safety committee chair, treats every snowflake like a personal insult and uses security as an excuse to harass anyone she does not like. My car is essential for my commute and client calls, and the HOA has a towing contract that Carol loves to weaponize, so every time she threatens my vehicle, I feel my chest tighten. This morning, she is holding a bucket of gravel in one hand and a folded rule packet in a plastic sleeve in the other, and she keeps saying the gravel proves I am damaging the concrete, even though the HOA hired the plow company. Carol is telling me the pile blocks the sidewalk even though the sidewalk is 5 feet away and completely clear. She says, I am calling management, and I am going to be dramatic about it. I tell her the plow put the snow there and I will move it when I have time, but she cuts me off and says time is not an option, because the rule is the rule. I ask her to show me the specific section of the policy, and she flips the laminated sheet around, but the text is too small to read in the dim light, and she pulls it back before I can get close. She says I should have received the winter addendum in my welcome packet 2 years ago, and if I lost it, that is my problem. I did receive a packet, but I never saw any addendum about snow pile placement, and I am starting to suspect she is making this up as she goes. She moves 2 orange cones from the curb to the edge of my driveway and says they mark the violation zone. I watch her adjust them 3 times in 10 seconds, each time shifting them closer to my property line. She tells me the cones stay until I comply, and if I move them, she will call the police for tampering with HOA safety equipment. I take a slow breath and smile, because I stayed polite, because polite makes bullies careless. I do not argue about the cones. I do not touch the laminated sheet. I just pull out my phone and start recording, and the moment the camera is visible, she spins around and storms off through the snow, shouting over her shoulder that I will regret ignoring the rules. I spend the next hour moving the snow pile by hand, 1 shovel load at a time, and piling it in the grass strip behind my driveway where it cannot possibly block anything. My gloves are soaked through by the time I finish, and my shoulders are burning, but I take photos of the cleared area and the new pile location and text them to the HOA management company with a polite note saying I addressed the concern. I also take a photo of the 2 orange cones still sitting in my driveway, and I leave them exactly where Carol placed them because I know she is going to claim I moved them. 2 hours later, I get an email from the management company saying my snow removal is under review and I need to attend a compliance hearing in 72 hours. The email does not specify what rule I violated, just that Carol filed a formal complaint and the board is taking it seriously. I call the management office and get a voicemail. I call again an hour later and get the same voicemail. I start to realize the management company and Carol are working together, and that makes my stomach drop because it means this is not just one angry neighbor, it is a coordinated system. I reach out to my neighbor 2 doors down, a guy named Marcus who works nights and is usually home during the day. He has been friendly since I moved in, and he warned me once that Carol has a habit of targeting people she thinks are not respecting her authority. I knock on his door, and he opens it in sweatpants and a hoodie, looking half asleep, and I explain what happened this morning. He nods slowly and says Carol did the same thing to him last winter over a snow shovel he left leaning against his garage door. She claimed it was a fire hazard and got the management company to send him a notice, and he ended up paying a $50 fine just to make it go away. He tells me the trick is documentation, and he offers to write a statement for me if I need a witness. I thank him and take him up on it. That afternoon, I am in my garage with a portable space heater running while I organize tools and gear for the next day's job site. The temperature outside is 12 degrees, and the garage is not insulated, so the heater is the only thing keeping my hands functional. I hear a knock on the side door, and I open it to find a man in a reflections vest holding a clipboard. He says he is with the Fire Safety Inspection Service, and he needs to verify my compliance with County Fire Code. I ask him who sent him, and he says the HOA requested a random audit of all garages in the community. I ask for identification, and he shows me a laminated card with a company name I have never heard of, and I tell him I am not letting him inside without a scheduled appointment and written notice. He shrugs and says that is my choice, but non-compliance will be noted in his report. He leaves, and I immediately call the county fire marshal's office. The person who answers tells me the county does not contract with private inspection services for residential properties, and if someone is claiming to be a county inspector, I should report it. I file a report on the spot and get a case number. I text Marcus and tell him what just happened, and he responds within seconds, saying Carol has used vendor harassment before. He says last year she sent a landscaping crew to his house to quote a lawn violation repair, and when he refused to hire them, the HOA tried to fine him for the unrepaired violation. He never paid, and eventually the fine disappeared after he threatened to go to the local news. I realize Carol is escalating, and the fake fire inspector was step one. I start taking notes on everything, every interaction, every email, every phone call. I also start digging through my HOA documents, looking for anything that mentions snow removal or pile placement. I find the main rulebook, but there is no winter addendum, no mention of snow piles, and no specific policy about where snow can or cannot be placed after plowing. The closest thing I find is a general clause about not obstructing common areas, but my driveway and lawn are not common areas. That night, I get a call from a towing company saying my vehicle has been flagged for removal due to a parking violation. I ask what violation, and the dispatcher says my car is parked in a fire lane. I walk outside, and my car is in my assigned driveway spot, exactly where it has been parked every night for 2 years. I tell the dispatcher there is no fire lane here and this is my private driveway, and he puts me on hold. When he comes back, he says the complaint was filed by the property management company and he is required to respond, but he agrees to send a driver to verify before towing. 20 minutes later, a tow truck pulls up, and the driver gets out, looks at my car, looks at the driveway, and shakes his head. He tells me there is no violation, and whoever called this in wasted his time. I ask him to document that in writing, and he gives me a card with the incident number and his name. I thank him and take a photo of the card, and then I take another photo of my car in the driveway, with the house number visible in the frame. The next morning, Carol corners me before sunrise, while I am shoveling the fresh snow that fell overnight. My gloves are wet and useless, and I am trying to clear the walkway before I leave for a client meeting. She walks up with her orange cones and her bucket of gravel and starts moving the cones again, this time placing them directly in front of my car. She says the snow I moved yesterday created a drainage issue, and now the HOA is liable for any slip and fall injuries. I ask her where the drainage issue is, and she points vaguely at the street, where a thin layer of ice has formed overnight, the same layer that formed on every other street in the neighborhood. I tell her the ice is from the overnight freeze and has nothing to do with my snow pile, and she says, "I will bury you in notices until you run out of printer ink." I do not respond. I just finish shoveling and go inside to change my gloves. When I come back out 10 minutes later, Carol is gone, but the cones are still there, and there is a bright yellow notice taped to my front door. The notice says I am in violation of Aurora Pines Estates Association Policy Section 4.7, and I have 48 hours to remedy the issue or face a $500 fine. There is no description of what Section 4.7 says, no copy of the policy, and no instructions on how to remedy the issue. I take a photo of the notice, then I peel it off and bring it inside. I pull out my HOA rulebook again and flip to Section 4.7. The section is labeled General Maintenance Standards and includes one sentence: all exterior areas must be kept in good repair. There is no mention of snow, no mention of drainage, no mention of ice, The rule is so vague it could mean anything, and I realize that is the point. Carol is using vague language to justify whatever harassment she wants, and the management company is backing her up. I call an attorney that afternoon, a guy who specializes in HOA disputes. I explain the situation, and he listens without interrupting. And when I finish, he tells me this is a classic case of selective enforcement. He says the HOA is allowed to enforce rules, but they have to enforce them consistently across all residents. And if they are targeting me specifically while ignoring the same behavior in others, that is legally actionable. He also says the fake fire inspector and the fraudulent tow call are serious problems. And if I can prove the HOA coordinated those actions, I might have grounds for a harassment claim. He tells me to keep documenting everything and to request copies of all HOA meeting minutes, budgets, and enforcement records for the past year. He says those documents will show whether other residents were fined for snow piles, and if they were not, that proves selective enforcement. I thank him and hang up, and then I draft a formal records request and email it to the management company. I also CC the HOA board president and treasurer, just to make sure someone sees it. The response comes back in less than an hour, and it is not what I expected. The management company says my records request will take 30 days to process, and there is a $50 administrative fee. I forward the email to my attorney, and he calls me back within minutes, furious. He says 30 days is excessive, and the $50 fee is likely illegal under South Dakota law, which requires HOAs to provide records within 10 business days and limits fees to actual copying costs. He tells me to reply and cite the statute, and to warn them that any further delay will result in a formal complaint to the state. I send the reply, and this time I do not CC anyone. I want the management company to know I am serious, and I want them to feel the pressure without the board watching. 2 days later, I get a package in the mail, a thick envelope with no return address. Inside is a stack of printed emails, and the headers show they are messages between Carol and the management company. The emails go back 6 months, and they show a clear pattern. Carol is not just filing complaints, she is coordinating with the management company to target specific residents, and the management company is helping her fabricate violations. One email from Carol says, "We need to push the snow removal issue harder," and the response from the management company says, "We will schedule a vendor visit to create urgency." Another email shows Carol asking the management company to flag my car for towing, and the management company agrees without questioning whether there is an actual violation. The emails are dated, time-stamped, and signed with full names. This is the proof I need, and I have no idea who sent it to me, but I am not going to question it. I call my attorney and read him the emails over the phone. He tells me to make 3 copies immediately and to store them in separate locations. He also tells me to photograph every page and upload the images to a cloud account. He says this is the kind of evidence that wins cases, and if the HOA or the management company finds out I have it, they will try to claim it as stolen or fabricated. I do exactly what he says, and then I sit down and read through the emails again, slowly this time. The pattern is worse than I thought. Carol has been doing this for at least 6 months, targeting residents who she perceives as threats or who challenge her authority. The management company has been enabling her every step of the way, and in some cases, they have been actively helping her escalate conflicts. One email references a budget line for winter vendor services, and the amount listed is $30,000, which seems absurdly high for a neighborhood of 60 homes. I make a note to ask my attorney about that. The compliance hearing is scheduled for 6 p.m. on a Thursday, and the location is the community clubhouse at the edge of the neighborhood. I arrive 15 minutes early with a folder full of documents, printed copies of the emails, photos of the snow pile and the cones, the fake fire inspector report, the tow truck incident number, and my attorney's contact information. The hearing room is a small conference space with a folding table and 8 chairs, and Carol is already sitting at the head of the table with the HOA board president and the property manager. Carol has her orange cones stacked in the corner and her bucket of gravel sitting on the table in front of her like a trophy. The board president is a man in his 60s named Ed who always looks tired, and the property manager is a woman in her 40s named Angela who avoids eye contact. I sit down across from them and wait. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA drama. Ed opens the hearing by reading a prepared statement about HOA rules and the importance of compliance. He says the board takes violations seriously and expects all residents to follow the policies outlined in the welcome packet. He says Carol has filed a complaint regarding snow removal and drainage, and the board is here to determine whether I am in violation and what the appropriate remedy is. I raise my hand and ask if I can speak, and Ed nods. I start by asking Ed to identify the specific rule I violated, and he looks at Carol. Carol pulls out her folded rule packet in a plastic sleeve and slides it across the table. I open it and flip through the pages, and there is no winter addendum. The packet is identical to the one I received 2 years ago, and there is no mention of snow pile placement, drainage, or any of the things Carol has been accusing me of. I point this out and Carol interrupts, saying the rule is implied under the general maintenance standard. I ask her to show me where it says that, and she says it is common sense. I tell her common sense is not a rule, and if the HOA wants to fine me, they need to cite a specific policy. Ed looks uncomfortable and says he will take that under advisement. I pull out the photos of the snow pile and the cleared walkway and pass them across the table. I explain that the plow created the pile, not me, and that I moved the snow as soon as Carol complained. I show them the photos of the cones in my driveway and explain that Carol placed them there without my permission and threatened me with police action if I moved them. Angela, the property manager, finally speaks up and says the cones are HOA property and are used to mark safety hazards. I ask her if my driveway is a safety hazard, and she does not answer. I pull out the tow truck incident report and explain that someone from the management company called in a fraudulent towing request, and the driver confirmed there was no violation. Angela's face goes pale, and she says she will look into that. I pull out the fire inspector report and explain that a fake inspector showed up at my house claiming to be sent by the HOA, and the county confirmed they do not contract with private services. Ed leans forward and asks if I am accusing the HOA of fraud, and I say I am accusing someone of coordinating harassment, and I have evidence to prove it. I do not show them the emails yet. I want them to dig their own hole first. Carol stands up and says I am wasting everyone's time with lies and excuses, and that the board should fine me immediately and move on. Ed tells her to sit down, and she does, but she is glaring at me the entire time. Ed says the board will review the evidence and issue a decision within 10 business days. I thank him and stand up to leave, and as I am walking out, Carol says, "You think you are so smart, but I will bury you in notices until you run out of printer ink." I stop in the doorway and turn around, and I smile at her. I say, "That is an interesting phrase, Carol. I will remember that." She looks confused, and I leave before she can respond. The next day, I get a text from Marcus saying the community mail carrier wants to talk to me. Her name is Denise, and she has been delivering mail in Aurora Pines for 8 years. I meet her at the mailbox cluster near the entrance to the neighborhood, and she tells me she has seen Carol harassing residents for years. She says Carol has a habit of intercepting mail and posting notices on doors when people are not home, and she has seen Carol take photos of residents' driveways and cars without permission. Denise says she witnessed Carol posting at least 4 notices on my door over the past 2 weeks, and she is willing to write a statement and testify if needed. I thank her and get her contact information, and I add her to my list of allies. That night, I receive a call from an unknown number, and when I answer, a woman's voice says, "You need to drop this." The voice is calm and professional, and I do not recognize it. I ask who is calling, and she says it does not matter. What matters is that I am making things harder for everyone by refusing to comply. She says the HOA has rules, and those rules exist for a reason, and if I continue to challenge the board, I will regret it. I ask if she is threatening me, and she hangs up. I immediately call my attorney and tell him about the call, and he tells me to file a police report. I do, and the officer who takes the report says anonymous threats are hard to prosecute, but the report creates a record in case things escalate. I get a case number and add it to my folder. The 10 business days pass, and I do not hear anything from the board. On day 11, I send an email to Ed asking for an update, and he responds saying the board is still reviewing the evidence and will issue a decision soon. On day 15, I send another email, and this time I CC my attorney. Ed responds within an hour saying the board has decided to table the matter pending further investigation. I reply and ask what that means, and he does not respond. I call my attorney, and he says tabling is a stall tactic, and the HOA is hoping I will give up or move. He says we need to force their hand, and the best way to do that is to file a formal complaint with the state and request an audit of the HOA's finances and enforcement records. He says the email chain I have is grounds for an investigation, and if the state finds evidence of coordinated harassment or financial impropriety, the HOA could lose its certification, and the management company could lose its contract. I tell him to file the complaint, and he does it that afternoon. 2 days later, Carol shows up at my house at 5:30 in the morning, banging on my door hard enough to wake the neighbors. I open the door and she is holding a stack of papers and screaming about subpoenas and lawyers and how I am destroying the neighborhood. She shoves the papers at me and says I have been served, and then she storms off before I can say anything. I look at the papers, and they are not a subpoena. They are a notice from the HOA saying I am being fined $1,500 for harassment of board members and obstruction of HOA business. The notice cites no specific rule, no evidence, and no hearing date. I take photos of every page and forward them to my attorney, and he calls me back within minutes, laughing. He says the notice is legally meaningless and unenforceable, and the fact that Carol delivered it personally proves she is panicking. He says the state audit is moving forward and the HOA knows it. He tells me to sit tight and let the process play out. The following week, I get an email from the state saying an auditor has been assigned to review the Aurora Pines Estates Association's records, and the audit will include financial statements, meeting minutes, enforcement logs, and vendor contracts. The email says the audit will take approximately 30 days, and the HOA is required to cooperate fully. I forward the email to Marcus and Denise, and Marcus replies saying half the neighborhood is talking about the audit, and people are starting to ask questions. He says Carol has been noticeably quiet, and Ed has been avoiding the clubhouse. I allow myself to feel a tiny bit of hope. The courthouse has shortened winter hours, and I need to file paperwork for a separate issue related to my business, and the deadline is tight. I drive downtown on a Wednesday afternoon, and the roads are a mess, ice and slush everywhere, and parking is a nightmare. I find a spot 2 blocks away and walk to the courthouse in the freezing wind, and by the time I get inside, my hands are numb. I file the paperwork and get a stamped copy, and then I head back to my car. As I am walking through the parking lot, I see Carol standing next to a tow truck at the edge of the block, pointing at my car. I speed up and reach my car just as the tow driver is hooking up the front end. I shout at him to stop, and he looks up, annoyed. He says the car is parked in a permit-only zone, and he was called to remove it. I show him my parking receipt and he checks his paperwork, and then he shakes his head and unhooks my car. He says someone called in a fake complaint, and he is done wasting his time on this neighborhood. He drives off, and Carol is gone. I drive back to the neighborhood, and I am furious, but I am also starting to see the shape of the endgame. Carol is escalating because she is losing control, and the management company is helping her because they know the audit is going to expose them. I need to force the confrontation before they have time to cover their tracks. I text Marcus and ask him to help me organize a petition, and he agrees immediately. We draft a simple statement saying the residents of Aurora Pines Estates Association demand transparency, accountability, and an emergency meeting to address concerns about selective enforcement and vendor contracts. We print 20 copies and spend 2 evenings going door to door, and by the end of the week, we have 40 signatures. That is more than 2/3 of the homeowners, and under the HOA bylaws, that is enough to force a special meeting. We submit the petition to the board on a Monday morning, and Ed calls me that afternoon. He sounds exhausted, and he says the board will schedule a special meeting for the following week. He says the meeting will be open to all residents, and the board will address the audit, the vendor contracts, and the enforcement concerns. He also says Carol will be present, and he expects everyone to remain civil. I agree, and I hang up feeling like I am finally going to get some answers. The meeting is scheduled for 7 p.m. on a Thursday, and the location is the same clubhouse where the compliance hearing was held. I arrive early with Marcus and Denise, and the room is already packed. There are at least 30 residents crammed into a space designed for 12, and people are standing along the walls. Carol is sitting at the head of the table with Ed and Angela, and she has her bucket of gravel in front of her again, like a security blanket. Ed calls the meeting to order and starts reading a prepared statement, but he is interrupted by a resident in the back who stands up and asks about the audit. Ed says the audit is ongoing, and the board cannot comment until it is complete. Another resident asks about the vendor contracts and the $30,000 line item for winter services, and Ed says those contracts are reviewed annually and are within budget. A woman near the front asks why Carol is still on the safety committee after multiple harassment complaints, and Ed says the board is reviewing those complaints and will take appropriate action. The room erupts in shouting, and Ed bangs a gavel on the table to restore order. I raise my hand and Ed recognizes me. I stand up and say I have evidence that Carol and the management company have been coordinating harassment against multiple residents, and I would like to present that evidence to the board. Carol interrupts and says I am lying, and Ed tells her to be quiet. I pull out the printed emails and walk to the front of the room, and I hand the stack to Ed. He flips through the pages, and his face goes from tired to horrified in about 10 seconds. He looks at Angela, and she looks away. He looks at Carol, and she is gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles are white. I say, these emails show a pattern of coordinated harassment, fraudulent vendor calls, and selective enforcement. They also show that Carol has been working with the management company to fabricate violations and intimidate residents. I stayed polite, because polite makes bullies careless, and Carol just made every mistake I was hoping she would make. Ed sets the emails down and says the board will recess to review the documents, and the meeting will resume in 15 minutes. The board members and Angela leave the room, and the residents start talking in loud, angry voices. Carol stays in her seat, staring at the table, and no one approaches her. Marcus leans over and whispers, "You just nuked her." I nod, and I do not feel good about it, but I do feel relieved. This has been months of harassment, months of stress, months of wondering if I was going to lose my car or my home or my business, and now it is finally out in the open. The board comes back after 20 minutes, and Ed looks like he aged a decade. He says the board has reviewed the evidence and finds it credible. He says the board is terminating the management contract with Angela's company effective immediately, and the board is hiring an interim management firm to conduct a full audit of all HOA finances and enforcement actions. He says the audit will take approximately 60 days, and during that time, all enforcement actions are suspended. He also says Carol is being removed as safety committee chair, and she will no longer have authority to file complaints or coordinate vendor actions. The room erupts in applause, and Carol stands up and shouts something I cannot hear over the noise. Ed bangs the gavel and says the meeting is adjourned, and Carol storms out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The next morning, I receive a call from a number I do not recognize, and when I answer, a woman's voice says she's with the state auditor's office. She says the audit has uncovered evidence of financial misconduct, including inflated vendor invoices and kickback payments to board members. She says the HOA's winter services contract was for $30,000, but the actual work performed was worth less than $8,000, and the difference was funneled to Carol and Angela through a series of shell invoices. She says the state is referring the case to law enforcement, and criminal charges are likely. She asks if I am willing to provide a statement, and I say yes. She schedules an appointment for the following week, and I hang up feeling like the nightmare is finally ending. 2 weeks later, the interim management company releases a preliminary report, and the findings are damning. The report shows that Carol filed false complaints against 12 residents over the past 18 months, and the management company processed all of them without investigation. The report also shows that the HOA's vendor contracts were awarded without competitive bidding, and several vendors have financial ties to Carol and Angela. The report recommends sweeping reforms, including new bylaws, a new board election, and a ban on vendor relationships with board members. The report is posted on the HOA website, and within hours, the neighborhood group chat is blowing up. People are demanding resignations, refunds, and accountability, and Ed announces that he is stepping down as board president effective immediately. The final showdown happens 3 weeks later at the gas station lot at the edge of the subdivision. I am filling up my car on a Saturday afternoon when Carol pulls up in her SUV and parks behind me, blocking me in. She gets out with her phone in her hand, recording, and she starts shouting about how I ruined her life and destroyed the neighborhood. She says I am a liar and a fraud, and she is going to sue me for defamation. I do not respond. I just stand there with the gas pump in my hand, waiting for her to finish. She gets closer, still recording, and she says, "You think you won, but I have friends. I have lawyers, and I am going to make sure you never feel safe in this neighborhood again." I look directly at her phone camera and say, "Carol, everything you just said is on video, and I am filing a restraining order on Monday." She stops recording and stares at me, and for the first time I see real fear in her eyes. She gets back in her SUV and drives off, and I finish filling my tank. The restraining order is granted 2 weeks later, and Carol is prohibited from contacting me or coming within 100 feet of my property. The criminal investigation moves forward, and Carol and Angela are both charged with fraud and conspiracy. The trial is scheduled for later in the year, and I am listed as a witness. The HOA holds a special election, and a new board is seated with a mandate to clean house. The new board votes to refund all fines issued under Carol's complaints, and I receive a check for $1,500 along with a formal apology. The neighborhood slowly returns to normal, and people start talking to each other again instead of hiding behind closed doors. One morning, I am shoveling snow in my driveway when Denise walks by with her mail cart. She stops and says she heard Carol moved out last week, and the house is going up for sale. She says the neighborhood feels lighter already, like a weight has been lifted. I agree, and I tell her I could not have done it without her and Marcus. She smiles and says that is what neighbors are for, and she keeps walking. I finish shoveling and go inside, and for the first time in months I feel like I can breathe. The HOA holds a community meeting a month later to present the final audit report and the new bylaws. The turnout is huge, and the mood is optimistic. The new board president, a retired teacher named Linda, walks through the findings and explains the reforms. The winter services contract is being rebid with full transparency, and the new vendor is charging $8,000 for the same work that Carol's vendor charged $30,000 for. The HOA is issuing refunds to every resident who is overcharged, and the total comes to over $50,000. Linda also announces that the board is implementing a formal complaint process with checks and balances, so no single person can weaponize the rules the way Carol did. The room applauds, and I feel a genuine sense of pride in the neighborhood for the first time since I moved in. A few weeks later, I am at the mailbox cluster checking my mail when Marcus walks up. He says he just heard that Carol's court date got moved up, and the prosecution is pushing for a plea deal. He says the word around the neighborhood is that Angela already took a deal and is cooperating with the state, which means Carol is going to face the full weight of the charges. He also says the HOA is considering a lawsuit against Carol and Angela to recover the stolen funds, and if they win, the neighborhood could see even more refunds. I tell him I am just glad it is over, and he laughs and says it is not over yet, but it is getting close. That night, I sit in my garage with my space heater running, organizing tools for the next day's job, and I think about everything that happened. I think about the early morning confrontations in the snow, the fake inspectors and fraudulent tow calls, the endless notices and threats. I think about the emails that someone anonymously sent me, the petition that forced the board to act, and the moment Ed's face changed when he read those pages in front of the entire neighborhood. I think about Carol's face at the gas station, the fear and rage and disbelief when she realized she had lost. I stayed polite, because polite makes bullies careless, and in the end, Carol's own arrogance and vindictiveness were what buried her. The doorbell video I recorded the morning she came by screaming was played at the board meeting, and she claims she never came by, and the doorbell video plays anyway, and the room went silent. The HOA issues a memo clarifying the rule Karen weaponized, and it turns out the snow rule she kept quoting was never properly adopted, and the paperwork is blank. The memo explains that the general maintenance clause was never intended to cover snow removal. and the board is drafting a new winter policy with input from residents. The memo also states that any future enforcement actions must cite specific policy language, and vague or implied rules will not be accepted. It is a complete reversal of everything Carol stood for, and it is exactly what the neighborhood needed. Karen is removed as meeting chair and loses the microphone control, which means she can no longer dominate board meetings or silence residents who challenge her. The new board implements a rotating chair system, and every member gets an equal voice. The change is small but symbolic, and it sends a clear message that the days of one person running the HOA like a dictatorship are over. A neighbor petition that forces a vote during the meeting was the turning point, and the moment the board realized they could not ignore 40 signatures was the moment the power shifted. The petition is now framed in the clubhouse as a reminder of what happens when residents stand together. Spring arrives slowly, the snow melting in uneven patches, and the ice finally releasing its grip on the streets. The neighborhood feels different now, quieter but also more connected. People wave when they drive by, and conversations at the mailbox cluster last longer than a few polite sentences. The new board holds monthly coffee meetings at the clubhouse, and residents actually show up. The audit is complete, the reforms are in place, and the lawsuits are moving forward. Carol's house sells quickly, and a young couple moves in with a toddler and a golden retriever. They introduced themselves at the mailbox one afternoon, and they seemed genuinely excited to be part of the community. I do not tell them the full story, but I do tell them the neighborhood has been through some changes, and things are better now. They smile and say they are looking forward to getting to know everyone, and I believe them. I still see the orange cones sometimes in my memory, and I still feel the cold weight of those early morning confrontations. But I also see the stack of printed emails on Ed's table, the packed meeting room, and the moment the board voted to fire the management company. I see Marcus and Denise standing beside me, and I see the neighborhood coming together to demand accountability. I see Carol driving away from the gas station with fear in her eyes, and I see the restraining order being signed. I see all of it, and I know it was worth it. The fight was exhausting and terrifying and infuriating, but it was worth it because the neighborhood is better now, and the people who live here are safer. That is what matters. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next HOA story.